Good afternoon from London and welcome back to Mansion House. This morning's session, focusing on nature and net zero, making the case for private finance investment in nature beyond climate, sets up the discussion for this afternoon's session, financing a resilient future for all. Adaptation and resilient financing is not, in some parts of the world, an optional extra. It's a life-critical issue. As Mark Carney said yesterday, we cannot self-isolate from the climate challenge. We will first hear from Emma Howard-Boyd, Chair of the UK's Environment Agency and indeed a board member of the Green Finance Institute. Emma brings to these roles a depth of experience in corporate finance and asset management. Emma will lead a panel discussion on scaling investment into resilience, and her panel will include members that have had real experience in their home countries of the need for resilient financing. We will then hear from Dame Elizabeth Cawley, Chair of the Impact Investing Institute. Elizabeth will look at the particular challenge of impact investing in the emerging markets, greening those markets, taking the S in ESG and driving the achievement of sustainable development goals. No doubt, Elizabeth will welcome warmly the Chancellor of the Exchequer's announcement yesterday of the UK's first green gilt, which has been a real focus, something that is a real achievement and a real focus for the Impact Investing Institute and the Green Finance Institute in recent times. There are members of the Impact Investing Institute on the platform this afternoon, and I'd welcome you all to engage with them, to hear what they have to say through the platform. With that, I hope you enjoy the session this afternoon, and over to you, Emma.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Vincent. If COP26 is successful in accelerating economies in the race to zero emissions, climate shocks are still going to get worse. Without adaptation by 2050, climate change could depress growth in global agricultural yields up to 30%, disproportionately affecting small farms. The number of people who lack water at least 1 month per year could soar from 3.6 billion to more than 5 billion. And rising seas could force hundreds of millions of people in coastal cities from their homes, with total costs of more than $1 trillion each year. Dr. Salim Al-Hook on the panel today recently said, there could also be a race to zero vulnerability of every country by 2030 as an equivalent to the race to zero emissions. So why aren't we on a global race to zero vulnerability? Firstly, it's been hard enough to get the world to agree on the importance of reducing emissions, but it's fantastic that Joe Biden plans for the US to rejoin the Paris Agreement. Secondly, businesses have often been concerned with climate liability risks rather than channeling efforts towards the physical and transition risks. Thirdly, the language surrounding adaptation and resilience is absurdly complicated. Carbon reductions are simpler to measure compared with resilience to multiple climate shocks, but complexity and clarity aren't mutually exclusive. And finally, too many people see adaptation as an additional cost to business as usual. If you buy a door, you don't think of the lock as additional expenditure because locks are a fundamental part of the reason doors exist in the first place. Similarly, you can't drive to work on a flooded road, so investors should measure climate risk and factor it into decision making. At the Environment Agency, we are updating our guidance to ensure new coastal and flood defences in England are assessed against a range of future impacts, including sea level rise from a 4 degrees centigrade increase in global temperature by 2100. The private sector needs to act with that trajectory in mind. Adaptation has traditionally been funded by public money, which has been squeezed by coronavirus. I'm also the UK Commissioner to the Global Commissioner on Adaptation, which last year said adaptation investments consistently deliver higher returns with benefit cost ratios ranging from 2.1 to 10.1. In this country, the National Infrastructure Construction Procurement Pipeline 2020-21 is an opportunity with up to £37 billion of planned procurement over the next year. 45% of the previous programme of national infrastructure and construction was financed through the private sector. Things are starting to change. In September, California joined the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, launched by Alok Sharma at the UN General Assembly last year. The CCRI is now made up of organisations that represent over $10 trillion in assets. In the UK, the Council for Sustainable Business is also mobilising action. We should soon see the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity, which is expected to show the value of nature to our future resilience. Yesterday, the Environment Agency launched a £200 million resilience programme to innovate resilience measures and decrease flood risk. 25 areas will be selected for projects used to test approaches including tree planting and peatland restoration, rainwater harvesting and property level measures. Together with government, the Environment Agency has launched a £10 million investment readiness fund to develop private sector investment in natural capital with projects that generate revenue from ecosystem services. In the summer, with DEFRA, the Esme Fairbairn Foundation and Triodos Bank UK, we launched 4 projects that will restore wetlands, create natural flood management, reduce nitrate pollution, restore peatlands in the Pennines, and deliver sustainable financial returns. We are working with others in the finance sector, including the Green Finance Institute, to catalyse the scaling up of further similar projects both in the UK and around the world. Yesterday, the Chancellor's announcement of the UK's first green sovereign bond is a fantastic step that can help unlock a wall of investment and show we are serious about building a greener and more sustainable economy. There is momentum building, but we need to bring that up to speed with the pace of change. A race for resilience or to zero vulnerability could inject urgency and galvanise action. Today, I hope we can create the importance of financing a resilient future for all. Thank you very much. We'll now pause before the panel.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. So there's been a little bit of technical glitch here in the couple of the panelists unable to join, and we lost Emma briefly. So, well, maybe briefly, she may be back. But it's Salim Ul-Hook and myself, who I'm sure everyone knows Salim very well. So we're going to talk about some of the challenges and some of the solutions really to how to increase finance for adaptation and resilience. I'm just going to say a few words about the work we're doing at CDC Group. CDC, for those of you that don't know, we're the UK's Development Finance Institute and an impact investor, I think the biggest impact investor in Africa. And we launched a new strategy, climate strategy recently, where we've identified adaptation and resilience in two central ways. The first, to ensure that every investment we make now is resilient to climate impacts, to physical impacts of climate change, as well as to intentionally invest more in the types of businesses that are going to be needed to help countries, communities, sectors, and other businesses, in fact, become more resilient, to develop adaptation plans and become more resilient over time. And so we're seeing that in a few different ways. I mean, I think whilst we know that this is a really urgent challenge, we also see that there are a lot of market barriers to private sector investment. So, I mean, we only invest in the private sector at CDC. And so we see a lot of barriers there that need to be overcome. And I'd just like to maybe sort of highlight kind of some of what I see as the main barriers, really. So first of all, as I said, we need to ensure resiliency to investment, all our investments, particularly infrastructure as long-lived assets. And there we know there needs to be much more upstream incentives. Climate risk needs to be really embedded into government policy, regulatory context, particularly procurement, whether it's public procurement or public-private partnerships. So that's really essential. And that then can help create the pipelines of investments that really are resilient, or that have incentivized the private sector to do more in resiliency. And I think what's really important here is that now we need to think about a new form of public-private sharing of risks, as well as some of the rewards in terms of a financial return. So governments need to incentivize the private sector to invest more, to take on more of the risk, but then also, and through doing so, provide a public good, for the country and communities, but also enable some financial return as well. So, really bringing that new kind of risk sharing, risk-reward sharing. But also really important to think about how, we at CDC, we invest both directly or indirectly in companies. How can we also, whether, through our capital, but also through value add activities, work with businesses, whether it's financial institutions, whether it's corporates, to help build their adaptive capacity so that they themselves can start to integrate both climate risk into their assessments, but very, very importantly, ensure that their business strategies are going to be more resilient moving forward. So I would see that as a second really important area. And third, and I think this is something we're starting to see, particularly in Africa, where we see some interesting innovations being brought forward, mainly philanthropists such as the Gates Foundation or Climate Kick, they're doing some really interesting innovation and technology development. But how do we take these very early stage potential businesses and grow those? And how, what's the, I think, we often talk about this sort of valley of death when it comes to taking innovative technologies to market. And I do see at the moment, or we're seeing that there's a real need to plug that gap. We are seeing some very interesting potential opportunities, but really quite small scale and very, very early stage. And so, really how we overcome all those different issues is very much how we are now working with partners, working with our other EdFi colleagues, working with multilateral development banks, bilateral agencies. So all of this really, is going to be important. There's much greater collaboration, but also working very closely with financial institutions. And I know Salim and I spoke not long ago about the work that he's doing, and I think we've just made our first investment in BRAC Bank in Bangladesh, because I think that as a bank is also going to be a very key player now in helping to bring forward the types of businesses, finance the businesses, the business solutions, the services that are going to be needed to really enable adaptation and resiliency.
To bring in Salim from the International Centre for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh to talk about some of his work, and specifically how the Global South is approaching adaptation and what work is being done to collaborate, such a key theme of how we need to work on setting a global agenda. Over to you, Salim. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, and thank you, Amal Lee, for setting the scene. So let me share a little bit about the experience that we have in Bangladesh, where I'm speaking from, in the realm of adaptation and resilience, because that's obviously a very, very important aspect of the climate change issue for us, being one of the most vulnerable countries. But we've been doing some very interesting innovations, particularly in bringing public and private sectors together. So let me share a little bit about how we see the private sector's role. There are really a spectrum of private sector, ranging at the bottom from the farmers and fishers living on the coast of Bangladesh, who are actually investing their own money in buying salt tolerant varieties of rice, which are more expensive than the traditional varieties, in order to adapt to the impacts of climate change, using their own money to do that, converting rice fields to shrimp farms because they've become more saline and adapting to those conditions. So the adaptation activities of the very farmers, and I'm talking tens of millions of them, is actually a private sector investment of these individual farmers who are adapting to the impacts of climate change. Then moving up the scale, we have many millions of small and medium-sized enterprises that are providing all kinds of inputs to these farmers, commercial enterprises who are quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and who are also needing to adapt and enhance their resilience to the climate change issue. Very often not having enough capital themselves to be able to do that. And that is where the role of the bigger investment arms like the banks, and Amal Lee mentioned BRAC Bank, which is one of the major private sector banks in Bangladesh. We have many private sector banks in the country, and many of them are stepping up to look at this field and see what a role they can play in providing the kind of investments, backstopping, technical advice to the very large numbers of small and medium sized enterprises who don't have the capability of doing it themselves, but who can benefit from these kinds of investments and then have returns and secure their own business portfolios. And then finally, obviously, the large companies who have the ability to assess the risk and to put in place resilience measures. And we have quite a few of those large companies as well. Particularly, I would say, in the renewable energy sector, Bangladesh is one of the most thriving renewable energy sectors, which is doing both mitigation by putting in solar panels and enabling more than 5 million households to have them, but at the same time putting in combined mitigation and adaptation like solar pumps for irrigation, for example, to irrigate rice fields with the solar panels instead of diesel, which is traditionally used in that place. So a very wide spectrum of activities that range from public sector to private sector, and the role of all of them need to be integrated. So I think one of the big lessons that we have in Bangladesh, from Bangladesh, is that it isn't easy to bring the private sector in because adaptation and resilience tends to be seen as a negative. It's a risky issue, and they don't see what the benefit of taking it on board is. But once they do that, then it is possible to find ways in which there can be a return on the investment for the investors who are putting investments into this arena, and enable the public and the people who are being affected by impacts of climate change to become more resilient. And my final point will be to say that Bangladesh, even though we are one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change, are rapidly on our way to becoming one of the most resilient countries to the impacts of climate change. So just because we're a poor country doesn't mean we have to remain vulnerable. We can become more resilient, and the private sector can play a big role in that.
Thank you, Salim. And I think really encouraging to hear the progress that is being made. I think we all have a lot to learn from each other on the adaptation and resilience agenda. If I may, I'd like to explore a little bit more the integration point. It's something that I talk about a lot in terms of the UK, the need to make sure that we're focusing on adaptation and mitigation at the same time. And to Amelie as well, if you could give a few more examples of where you are helping small-scale actors achieve green futures with tech. So Salim, back to you first, and then Amelie for some further comments.
Sure. So I already mentioned the solar energy arena, where Bangladesh has one of the fastest and highest number of solar home systems in the world. In fact, 5.5 million households supplying solar energy to about 20 million people. At the same time, they are scaling up to larger scale solar energies in markets, and as I said, in particular for irrigation, enhancing the ability of farmers to irrigate their crops and thereby also become better adapted to the impacts of climate change with a much lower carbon emission footprint. Another arena where this is happening is in the coastal area of Bangladesh, where we are doing a large scale afforestation of mangrove forests, which is both public sector through the forest department, as well as private sector people growing trees in the coastal area, which has a mitigation benefit, obviously, with the trees absorbing carbon dioxide from the air, but also a significant adaptation benefit, particularly in protecting them from tidal surges, which happen every now and again, and cyclones, which we unfortunately face in Bangladesh almost every year to some extent. We just had a super cyclone a couple of months ago that hit the Sundarban mangrove forest very severely. Fortunately, Bangladesh has one of the best cyclone warning systems. We can evacuate, and we did evacuate more than 2 million people, so that the loss of life was absolutely minimal. It was only a few people who were out at sea and couldn't get back to land in time. But over 2.5 million people on land were able to get the warnings and go to shelters and thereby save their lives, although there was still quite a lot of damage from the cyclone. But the loss of life, which used to be in the tens of thousands in past decades when we had super cyclones of that magnitude, has been brought down very significantly, which is another successful adaptation in Bangladesh.
That's great to hear, and certainly one of the things that we've been doing here in the UK at the Environment Agency is enhancing our warning and informing ahead of the sorts of flood events that we've been experiencing. Amal, would you like to go into a little bit more detail some of the projects that you have been funding?
Yeah, so actually, two examples. I mentioned earlier that we need to think of adaptation or resilience of every investment, as well as deliver specifically adaptation and resiliency through investments. And so I'll give an example of each. One example, again, this is obviously a very a mitigation and adaptation investment in many respects. We have been working with Zephyr Power a wind farm developer in Pakistan that was looking to place the wind farm on basically a floodplain on the coastal area. And so they're actually, as Salim was saying, I mean, we looked at restoring the mangroves in that context, which have actually not just provided resiliency, but it's also created new opportunities for the local communities, new fishing, crabbing opportunities. And of course, biodiversity, we know, or increasingly we know, is can also bring other benefits, including resilience to potential diseases, and as we're hearing more and more about in the current circumstance. And that's one example of using a nature-based solution to provide resiliency to infrastructure. Another example is in India, we invested in a company, Roserve, that looks to recycle wastewater to provide that to farmers through drip irrigation, so to enable both more efficient water as well as to provide nutrients for growing crops, and that in a very water scarce area susceptible to future droughts. Obviously making more efficient use of water resources and wastewater is clearly something that can help provide more resiliency. But I think again also I'm sure if we looked at the emission reductions associated with that there would also be some benefits there. So those are just two examples of investments we've made. We're looking at there's more in the pipeline. As I say, they tend to be quite small scale, and but I think that's not to say a bad thing, because obviously we need to see businesses in the local context. But I think as Salim said, the challenge is how do we sort of increase financing to bring more and more of these SMEs or MSMEs along that will be needed. So you need to start to scale finance for a larger number of smaller businesses that will be needed.
Thank you. I've had another question from the audience about the role for regulation in accelerating the commercialization of nature-based solutions. Now, there's different types of regulation. I chair the Environment Agency, which is responsible for environmental regulation here in England, but there's financial regulation as well. What do you see the role being? Salim, perhaps you'd like to go first.
Sure. So I think the role of regulation, i.e. governmental actions in order both to stimulate investments as well as, on the other hand, to prevent negative kinds of investments, particularly in destroying ecosystems or nature, are both very important. And in the case of Bangladesh, I'll give an example of each. On the one hand, the afforestation that I mentioned that is taking place is also sometimes opposed or moved in the wrong direction by people cutting down trees. And the government has now instituted quite strict regulations on the cutting down of trees. And so Bangladesh is now very, very strongly protecting all our trees that already exist, and also has a very strong program of planting new trees. I mentioned the coastal mangrove systems, but these trees are now being grown everywhere, including in homesteads all over the country. And it's a very, very sound investment for families to make, because after a few years, the trees become very valuable. The other arena is in incentivizing. I mentioned the role of commercial banks like the BRAC Bank that I gave as an example. These are also being stimulated by regulation from the central bank. The Bangladesh Central Bank has a green fund incentive where they provide, I think it's in the order of $200 million equivalent, low interest loans to the commercial banks, for the commercial banks to then provide investments in resilient, climate-friendly, environment-friendly activities. There's a long list of things that are eligible, and they are able to draw those down. And that's been quite successful in getting not every bank, but quite a few banks involved in utilizing that facility for them to be incentivized to go into this relatively new sector. Or not every commercial bank is familiar with it. They have to go up a learning curve. They need to understand what it means. So a lot of what I do in my institute is we have training programs for the bankers, for them to understand how they can get into this sector and make a potentially good business investment from their point of view by accessing these low interest loans from the central bank and then providing it to their clients and their customers. So two kinds of regulations, one incentivizing and the other one disincentivizing bad activities.
And Amelie, do you have any comments about the role of regulators?
Yeah, I just want to fully agree with everything Salim said. So actually, in my previous role at the Inter-American Development Bank, we did a joint project with UN Environment to look at the role of nature-based solutions for resilient infrastructure. And I think it was exactly that. I mean, there's the sort of how do you regulate to ensure the do no harm, so don't destroy or reduce nature-based solutions, biodiversity. But also, very importantly, how do you incentivize the positive use of nature to provide real services? So, services that are actually of value to communities, to infrastructure assets. And I think a big part of that was building out the capabilities within the private sector. The project developers start to look for nature-based solutions for resiliency of infrastructure, instead of looking for what we call the grey alternative. So instead of concrete, looking, whether it's improving watershed management to reduce flooding, whether it's to, maintain wetlands to, again, reduce flooding in cities in particular. There's a concept of sponge cities, which I really looking at natural cooling through trees, green roofs. City of Paris has really done a lot in that area. So, but how do we incentivize the private sector to actually do that? What is the role of governments to do that? And so I think there's a role for both regulation and then sort of more positive incentives, whether that's through procurement, whether it's through integrating into public-private partnership guidelines, PPPs, or whether it's through other types of incentives and standards.
And the projects that I mentioned earlier that the Environment Agency is working on here in the UK are key to looking at the sorts of pilots that will work. Collaboration is absolutely crucial to getting this right, understanding then how we scale up. But our investment readiness fund is all about making sure that the delivery bodies understand how best to work with the finance sector. And I think this is where the environmental regulators, however they function in their different countries around the world, need to get closer to the financial regulators as well. Another initiative that is very live here in the UK at the moment is linking the different regulators of the water sector and the water companies to look at how we can accelerate investment. And that is something that will have a nod towards nature-based solutions, a nod towards adaptation and resilience. And again, I think is another live example of how regulators need to be collaborating to spur further action. I've got another question about what does civic society need from the finance sector to achieve progress? So how is it that the finance sector can help civil society gain the sorts of capacity and understanding of what's required to drive real change and real impact? Amelie, would you like to start off with that one first?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, when we say civic society, if we mean communities, and I think, Salim obviously is one of, probably the world leader on this issue of community-based adaptation. And, and that's, it's absolutely essential that that those types of actions, and that so maybe very small scale entrepreneurs are supported with the right kind of finance. And so I think, going back to the point that Celine made, how BRAC Bank as a financial institution in Bangladesh can provide the type of resource that is needed. But also, I think, and this is something CDC we're very much looking at now, is how can you bring the sort of additional expertise as well through financial intermediaries, to get to these small scale players, whether it's sort of community-based local entrepreneurs, civic society groups who have and are, already often providing an important adaptation benefit, meeting certain needs, but probably need further support to be able to continue that, or to be able to share that with other communities as well. And so I think, in bringing both finance that is affordable, as well as any resources that, in terms of building out the capabilities and enabling greater replication of activities. And often, I saw an interesting project that we had at IDB in Guatemala, where we're working with women groups, women communities, to help provide them with more resilient types of farming, in particular indigenous chickens, actually, which is really interesting, because very high levels of malnutrition in Guatemala. I mean, extremely high levels. And so there'd been a lot of work to demonstrate that was because of lack of protein. So being able to breed chickens for eggs, I mean, they may occasionally eat a chicken, but it's mainly really for eggs, so children could have eggs every day. And these chickens were indigenous, so they could survive in much hotter temperatures. This is in the dry valley of Guatemala. And what was really interesting is that those women groups would, and this was something financed through the IDB, but what was interesting is that those women groups then wanted to work with other women groups in neighboring regions of the country, so because they realized how valuable this was. So these sorts of things are incredibly important and really powerful.
Celine, would you like to add some comments to that?
Sure. So as Amali says, this is very much in my area of work. I work with community-based adaptation with the most vulnerable communities all over Bangladesh and in other least developed countries as well. And one of the biggest problems is at that very local, very small level. It's very difficult for financial institutions to penetrate and reach them. But there are ways to do that. And we mentioned BRAC Bank, which is actually a bank associated with BRAC, the NGO. And BRAC NGO is the biggest NGO in Bangladesh, and also now the biggest NGO in the whole world. They're working in many different countries in Asia and Africa as well. And BRAC has that ability to take hundreds of millions of dollars or pounds at the global level from large scale donors like the UK FCDO, or philanthropists like Bill Gates, and then channel that to the local level, to millions of local level participants. And they recently had an innovation for what they call a climate bridge fund, where they're providing small grants. They have a 10 million euro grant from the German government, but it's a trust fund where they provide small grants to local level communities in 5 cities. These are for migrants coming and living in the slums, climate migrants, and rehabilitating them and looking after them. So there's a lot of innovation going on that we can build on and learn from each other. And we are very keen to do both South-South and South-North learning and sharing knowledge. To us, knowledge and experiential knowledge is really the key, and expanding and scaling up on good, successful examples is the key to take these things forward and to greater success in the future.
Fantastic. So I think we've got time for one last question, and another one's come in about NDCs, saying that low-income countries have often got a strong adaptation resilience angle in NDCs, and should banks align their investing and their lending along those sorts of the adaptation aspects of NDCs? Who'd like to take that first? Amelie? Is that for you? And then Salim, a final
Sure.
comment.
Sure.
I think it's really important that the NDCs are fully integrated into the government's broader budget planning, financial planning, fiscal planning, and the adaptation resilience measures are, fully kind of mainstreamed across all the key sectors that are needed, and the role of the financial sector can then come in to finance those. I think there's different roles for different ways in which different actors can engage with for example, a bilateral agency or multilateral development bank can engage directly with the government to do that kind of activity. Then you can have DFIs like ourselves who can bring in the private sector to actually make those investments. I just want to give a little advertisement for an event we have on Thursday at the Financing Commons Summit, which is basically bringing together all the public development banks of the world to look at how we can collaborate more to address the issues of COVID and build back better for greener, resilient and inclusive economies. And we actually are hosting an event on adaptation and resilience and how to accelerate investment into adaptation resilience. So just wanted to flag that as my last comment.
Salim, very quickly, because we're almost out of time. Do you have a 10-second reply?
Indeed. I think the NDCs are about mitigation. That's compulsory. But well over 2/3 of them have included adaptation, even though it is optional. And I think that that's something that the banks and financial institutions should now have a look at. And I'm pretty sure they'll find good investments to be made on the adaptation side of the coin, as well as the mitigation side.
So a strong message ahead of the adaptation as the Ambition Summit that's taking place in December. I think we're out of time, so thank you very much for being with me this afternoon and bearing and putting up with some of the technological difficulties we've experienced. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be here to speak to you today. I've had to throw out my prepared remarks because actually we've heard that the government has announced something crucially important that will absolutely kickstart the progress we're going to make between this Green Finance Summit and COP26 in November 2021. What they've announced in terms of the willingness to issue a green plus gilt is quite remarkable. What this gilt will do, not just to channel green projects, which are vitally important, it will also give us the opportunity to create jobs with real skills in communities that can contribute to a transition to net zero. There is huge demand for this, which I will say and talk about in a moment, but it's just fantastic news. Now I'm going to go back to a few of my prepared remarks, but with a big smile on my face. The topic I really want to address is how can we use this summit this week as a springboard for action ahead of COP26 next year. It's really vital that we don't waste 12 months. We need to think very hard about how can the United Kingdom and all our friends around the world, how can the City of London and the corporates and investors and banks that work here and the legal and professional firms, how can we work together to use the next 12 months to maximum effect? Now, what do I mean by maximum effect? First of all, we know that we have an urgency around action. We also know that finance is absolutely vital. We play a critical role in making sure that the initiatives that need to be financed have the capital flowing and that the infrastructure we need to build ahead of use is financed in a timely manner. How do we do that? How do we increase the pace of innovation? How do we increase the pace of innovation at a startup level to make sure that the SMEs, of which we should be justifiably proud around this country, receive the lifeblood financing that they need? And how do we signal to the world that the United Kingdom is absolutely on target to meet our commitments to a net zero world? A lot of that is around transition financing. That's transition financing at home, cross-border, and internationally. And it's transition financing, and what I want to talk about particularly, that isn't just speedy, but also has a long-term effect. A long-term effect that goes beyond the project. An effect, as the Prime Minister said in his speech earlier this year, an effect that creates hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of jobs. Well, I'd like to add not just jobs, but skills. Skills for the future. We need to create an opportunity for people to reskill, relearn. It's not just about demonizing old world. It's about incentivizing new world and making sure that we have the financial flows that deliver on renewable energy, on natural resources, on a circular economy, and in doing so, we empower the citizens of this country to find new skills and new ways of contributing to a just transition. So what do we do about that? These are great words. We could all write them on a piece of paper. But if they only stay on a piece of paper in 12 months' time, they're doing nobody any good, not least ourselves, because it's our responsibility to contribute to that transition and to do so speedily and fairly. Well, here's a few thoughts to put into your minds as to what we could do in a meaningful way. Firstly, as you may know, I chair something called the Impact Investing Institute, having had a career in the city in the mainstream, realizing that if we don't get capital to flow to where it's needed most for people and planet, we are only doing part of our job as a financial system. As that chair of the Impact Investing Institute, we've worked in partnership with the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics and our sister institute, the Green Finance Institute, to put a proposal together to this government around a green plus gilt. In other words, we could issue sovereign debt in sterling, which is absolutely dedicated to the use of the proceeds to go to powering that infrastructure development, which will also create jobs, skills, and community resilience. The plus in here is the clue. It's not just green, although it's absolutely focused on green projects. It also links those projects to meaningful, measurable outcomes that will change people's lives, particularly in parts of the country that need that regeneration and the opportunities to benefit from a green economy. So the Green Plus Gilt would do two things. Firstly, it would signal to the world that this United Kingdom government really is committed to take transition to net zero to the next level. Infrastructure projects are great, but as the Prime Minister has said, as many of his other ministers have said, it's also about making sure that in doing so, we create the jobs and skills and communities that are necessary to build back better as we come through the virus. It's also a crucial part of levelling up. So we can see absolutely that this would signal that we can do it, and we can do it in a way that takes us to the next level. There are lots of naysayers to this in the past, that it's too complicated and too difficult, but actually it's not, and it's certainly not too expensive. Only last month we saw the German Ministry of Finance issue a 7.7 billion euro bond that was extremely well received by the market at no extra cost. This year we have reached the $1 trillion mark for green bond issuance. And if you look at the wider definition of sustainability finance, we're at $2 trillion. This is a rapidly growing trend. You don't have to take my word for it. I would say that, wouldn't I? We actually road tested this idea with a series of investors, pension funds, and financiers to see whether there would be appetite to buy a Green Plus gilt in sterling. And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. Over 40 institutions have signalled that they are very, very supportive of this idea, and among them they represent over £10 trillion of assets under management. So we absolutely can do this, and we can do it in a way that leads the way for the rest of the world, but also in an inclusive way. It's not just about the United Kingdom getting it right and doing the right thing. It's also about building an ecosystem here, not whether it's the City of London, whether it's in Edinburgh, whether it's in Cardiff, Belfast, or widely around the world. We absolutely can build the ecosystem we need to make sure that bond issuance, not just for the government, but also for corporates and for private sector really becomes more straightforward, making it easier and simpler to do. And if we get it right, if we take this idea forward, just think of what it does. It actually channels money to where it's going to deliver a transition to net zero in a way that is sustainable and creates opportunities for all, for everybody who is interested and willing to commit to that skill and redevelopment, whether it's a small business, a medium-sized business, or a large company that wants to do the right thing and disclose that it's doing the right thing. And if we get it right, just think about what we could do helping others around the world who also might wish to have a green plus issuance of their debt. This is an opportunity to show leadership, and it's an opportunity to do it now. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk to you about such an exciting idea. And I really hope that this, plus the opportunities arising from it, will kickstart our ability to make a change before November 2021. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for those inspiring words. And with the announcement yesterday by the Chancellor, there's everything to play for next year. We're now shortly going to have a break before the last session of the day, which is entitled The Road to Glasgow. And we are honoured and delighted to be joined by the First Minister of Scotland for that. The last 2 days have, in a sense, been about a lead up to that discussion, thinking towards the future with COP26 in mind. How do we prepare for that, taking into account the concerns of regulators, of government, of bankers, of insurance, of companies, and yes, of civic society, with all the extraordinary revolutionary thinking and talking that has been happening not only the last few days, but over the last few months. So please join us for that. We have a stunning lineup of speakers. That will start at 3:45.